hesitate to use an old cliche, but in this case, only time will tell, and there may be lots of it, perhaps 2 years before the country votes. Our guest this morning is the Shadow Minister for Climate Action and the Environment, Greg Hunt. But before then, we'll see what the Sunday papers are saying around the country. And the issue that seems to be picked up on asylum seekers this week is the reference to, or the lack of any reference to human rights in the amendment to the migration bill, and that has brought together the usual suspects, Lenore, the left of the Labor Party, human rights advocates and Tony Abbott.
Yeah, who'd have thought? So the left is pretty unhappy about this. They're threatening to vote against the amendments that Julia Gillard unveiled on Friday that would strip the human rights protections out of the migration laws to allow the Malaysia solution to proceed. So if the left does do that, as you say, they're going to be lining up to vote against the government amendment with the Greens and the Coalition. Which is in and of itself a kind of weird thing. But of course, the same human rights clause is necessary, according to the departmental advice and most legal advice, for Tony Abbott to implement his version of offshore processing as well. So it's a weird world.
And why would the government be reluctant to include a human rights clause in the bill? Is it because then that it makes it vulnerable to challenges in the High Court?
That's exactly the reason why they are loath to do that. And there is a lot of anger from the left because what Julia Gillard had told the caucus last week was that the government's intention was to return the law to the position before the High Court decision. And people in the left of the party argue that this does actually a lot more than that. It takes it a lot further for precisely that reason, that if you still have those other protections in there, there's a chance that human rights advocates and refugee advocates will take legal action against the very first decision to export, to send people to one of these countries.
So it's about flexibility, Malcolm. It's about, well, as the government argued, I suppose, they want the executive to determine policy on asylum seekers and not the courts.
That's right. I can't see why there's any great amazement over this. They essentially wanted to give overwhelming discretion to the minister to decide what is a designated country, a place where asylum seekers can be sent. And if you tack on lots of little provisos, then these things obviously can come up for legal challenge. So essentially the government's saying the minister will have this power and you're going to have to trust us to use it wisely. And a significant number of people in the Labor Party are saying, no, we don't trust you.
But the way we're headed, we're going to in fact have, by default, onshore processing, and the two major parties who both think we should have offshore processing arguing about whose fault it is.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, let's hear from Tony Abbott. This is what he had to say yesterday.
Now, I'm not a bleeding heart. I appreciate that governments sometimes have to do very tough things, but it is troubling that the protections that the Howard government thought were necessary for boat people being sent overseas have been absolutely stripped out by the current government. The Howard government and the Coalition not only has the patent on offshore processing, it's pretty obvious, having seen this legislation, that we also have the patent on offshore protection.
So they've got the patent on offshore protection. Now, very soon after that, the Immigration Minister, Chris Bowen, then fronted the media to respond to that, and he was eventually encircled by some protesters. Here it is.
Look, I think it's appropriate that the Minister of the day, regardless of the political party in office, have the capacity to weigh up the issues and to make a determination in the public interest. Now, firstly, our position is the Malaysia arrangement, which has got those human rights protections built into it. This is an arrangement where Malaysia has agreed to treat people with dignity and respect. People with respect.
Self-harm, 1,500 self-harms in detention centre this year alone. Shame, and now you're talking about Malaysia. Shame on yourself.
Clearly, this is a very controversial issue.
Shadow Immigration Minister was worried about human rights if the proposed draft legislation goes ahead.
Well, I don't think the Liberal Party's concerns about human rights, when you consider their policies, can be taken as being completely without question. Without question.
Malcolm, who are these people?
Well, I mean, they followed the minister to the car, and I think it was they went too. They took their self-righteousness a bit too far because they distressed his children and his wife who was in the car. They obviously went too far. But I don't know, I just was frighteningly reminding me of the convoy of no confidence people who encircled Anthony Albanese, the same sort of outrage and at times incoherent sort of berating of a minister, and the sheer delight of being able to do it. Maybe we've got these converging, the extreme
the spectrum meets again.
Coming around again. It's happened again.
Now, Misha, on the issue of peering, where one party agrees to cover for another in certain circumstances, it seems to have reached a new level this weekend.
It has indeed, and Stephanie Peatling in the Sun Herald has the story of how the Liberals are going to insist that the two, their side of the two delegates who go each session to the United Nations hearings for 3 months, Steve Chobo from the Liberal Party and Kelvin Thompson from the Labor Party. Normally, those people would not be called back for any kind of parliamentary business. You go for the 3-month period and you stay and you observe the United Nations. They're going to insist that not only does Steve Chobo come back for this vote, but that he pays his own way, so they're not accused of dipping into taxpayers'
so you
pockets.
got one from the government, one from the opposition. They're in New York. Why wouldn't you leave them there?
It makes absolutely no mathematical difference in a real sense, that's right. But the hardball politics of this is that you talk to Liberal people about why they've decided to play really so tough in this last session of Parliament on this issue. And one of the things they say is that they want to be able to campaign in Labor members' seats by showing their constituents the names on that roll of the final votes for the carbon tax legislation. So they want every Labor person to be there, and to force every Labor person to be there so they can campaign against them, they need the corresponding Libs to be in the chamber.
Nevertheless, in Kelvin Thompson's seat, you'd have to say it probably won't make a great deal of difference.
The People's Republic of Wills.
It might be a toxic tax, but not that toxic. And Malcolm, against that background, the front page leading the Daily Telegraph, something else altogether.
Yes, apparently the Prime Minister has been receiving coaching from somebody who's billed as a leadership skills trainer. And she took this coaching before 2 major speeches. One, the nationally televised speech before the introduction of the carbon pricing. And secondly, before an address to I think it was the New South Wales conference last July, homing her media skills, her presentation, and you'd imagine that there was a fair bit of work to be done, given that so many people comment on the Prime Minister's allegedly wooden presentation and, of course, her accent. But I can't say I saw much change in her delivery, harking back to those 2 speeches.
But this is not really about spin, then. It's about elocution.
It's about presentation rather than rather than content. That's for sure. And these days, it's not too unusual. I don't know how many of our former colleagues are out there telling people how to do interviews. And last April, there was a story confirmed by the opposition, April last year, sorry, that Tony Abbott received a similar sort of coaching, in part to tone down his belligerence when he delivered certain facts in which he believed most heartily. Labor, of course, called this an anger management course. That's going too far. But it seems these days, post-Howard, I can't imagine Keating or Hawke having got him, you need to have a little bit of training before you can talk to the people who voted for you.
OK, well, that's the Sunday papers. Now to our studio guest, the Shadow Minister for Climate Action and the Environment, Greg Hunt. And while he joins us here in the studio, here's the Climate Change Minister, Greg Combet, on what he says would be the cost of the Coalition's policy.